Anyways, let's get to it. Thanks everybody for joining us for the January 2022 MES Thursday night webinar. So the first one of the new year here. Hope everybody had a good holiday season and new year. Tonight's talk will focus on biosurveillance with Cerceris fumipennis. So we have Colleen Teerling with us. Thanks, Colleen, for joining us to present. So a little bit about Colleen, and then, yeah, if you have more questions for Colleen, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the talk, whether it's about, herself or the topics. So anyways, yeah, a little bit about Colleen. She's an entomologist with us at the Maine Forest Service. She's been with us for over 12 years. She works with emerald ash borer currently, as well as some other invasive species like hemlock woolly delgid and others. Colleen's from Canada. She went to school up there, so she got her bachelor's in New Brunswick and her master's degree in British Columbia. And yeah, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Colleen. And again, just a reminder, folks to stay muted and keep your webcams off, please. And this will be recorded and posted online in the near future here. So with that, take it away, Colleen. Thanks. All right, hopefully that solved it.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that was just me that was hearing that or if everybody was hearing it.
No, that was everybody. Somebody's random phone number was creating all sorts of chaos there. So sorry about that.
Okay, all right, let me get going again. Okay, so when Charlene called me up before Christmas and asked me to talk about the whole biosurveillance and citizen science program that we had for biosurveillance, my first thought was, oh, well, we're not even really doing that anymore. That wasn't really that great of a success. In fact, we stopped doing it. Does that mean it was a failure? And so I was a little bit hesitant at first, and then I started to think a little bit more about it and realized, no, it wasn't really a failure. There were some phenomenal successes. There were some resounding flops and failures, and it sort of was a mixed bag. And so this is just going to be the story of our citizen science program with the wasp watchers for biosurveillance, looking for emerald ash borer. Citizen science before citizen science even got to be a really big buzzword. So this started back probably the 2 or 3 weeks after I started with the Maine Forest Service. And in 2008, I was out with Dennis Sudo, who was an entomologist with the US Forest Service. And he said to me, if I said the word biosurveillance to you, what would you think of? And I was not really certain. I said, is that, looking for something that's living or using something that's living to look for something else? And he said, yeah, it's using one organism to look for another organism. In this case, it's using the wasp, Cerceris fumipennis, to look for emerald ash borer. And I was kind of intrigued. So I went back and started to look up a little bit of information about Cerceris fumipennis. Okay, and as my screen, it's not going to advance. Hang on. There we go. Okay. So Cerceris fumipennis is a hunting wasp in the family Crebronidae. And there's a bunch of them, and most of them will specialize on a certain group of insects to feed on, and they will paralyze their prey and bring them back and put them in their nests or their burrows to feed their young. And there's a whole bunch of them. And as I was looking in doing a Google search image, just sort of to look for stock photographs of crabronid insects, I noticed, found this one, and I'm no taxonomist, but I'm not entirely certain that she is a crabronid wasp. But maybe she's a hunting wasp, who knows. So this is Cerceris fumipennis, and it has beautiful, deep, smoky, dark wings, very distinctive, and it hunts buprestids. And what it will do is we'll go out and collect buprestids, capture buprestids, adult buprestids, and paralyzes them, brings them back, and brings them into their nest to feed their young. And sorry, why is this not working? So there are a lot of things that make Cerceris fumipennis really practical and good for working with in a biosurveillance program. One of the things is, although it looks like a stinging wasp and it buzzes really scarily, it cannot sting. And it's a really tolerant of being handled. It's really tolerant of being messed with. You can capture it and let it go, and it just sort of shakes its head, flies off, and goes back to hunting. It's a solitary nester, but it tends to live in these loose colonies. Colonies can be anywhere from two wasps to 500 or more, sometimes 1,000 or more. So the female has a really distinctive face. There's 3 yellow spots on her face. There's nothing else out there that looks like her, so you can't really mistake it for anything else. And the male is much smaller than the female. The male only has 2 spots on his face. And they're very short-lived. They emerge slightly before the females, and they mate with the females when the females come out. And then after that, they die, and they're just out of the picture entirely. After mating, the females will start digging a nest in the ground. They like hard-packed, sandy soil, and their nests are perfectly round, and so it does make them relatively easy to find. There are some wasps that will dig out their nests sort of like a dog digs a hole, and all the soil is paddled off to one side. These guys go down in and push the soil out, making this beautiful or this very sort of almost perfect round tumulus around the nest. The nest is about the diameter of a pencil. And as I said, they tend to be found in hard-packed, sandy, sunny sites. Once they dig their nests, early on, there tends to be a little bit of jockeying for the best nests. You can see here, there's a wasp that's approaching a nest, and if you look really closely, you can see the yellow spots of the wasp that's in her nest. And as the wasp approaches, the one in the nest kind of rears her head out a little bit and warns off the invading wasp, who then leaves and goes back to her own nest. So the wasp will dig out this nest, and she creates egg chambers. The nest goes down about 10 to 12 inches, depending on where the bedrock is under the soil. Goes down, straight down for a ways, and then kind of angles off a little bit, and she will dig out egg niches to the side of that nest. And when she's, actually I should say before I leave that, so when she's not actually out hunting or excavating her nest, she tends to sort of sit right there at the entrance to her nest to guard it, largely from other predators. There are a lot of predators that will come in and would like to, eat the eggs and this store of buprestids that she has down there. So when they're not doing anything else, they hang out there right at the nest. So then when they leave to go hunting, they're very good at finding their nest, their particular nest, in amongst all the others on this baseball field or gravel pit or wherever it happens to be. And so as they leave, they do this sort of slow, lazy spiral as they're spiraling up, orienting themselves, and then they take off into the nearest woods to go hunting for buprestids. Then when they find something, they tend to come straight back. There are kleptoparasites, which are tiny little parasitic, usually flies, that will come in and they will follow the female when she's carrying her prey back. And in just a fraction of a second, they can lay their egg on that buprestid. So if the female is slow and lazy on her way back to the nest, a kleptoparasite can come in, lay an egg. That egg will then hatch before the sorceress egg hatches, and will feed on the buprestids, and the sorceress egg will then starve, or the sorceress larvae will starve when it hatches. So they have to be pretty quick to get back. As you can see, sometimes their prey is really big. Sometimes their prey is actually bigger than the wasp is. And towards the end of the summer, when their wings get kind of tattered, some of them have a really tough time to actually get their prey back. And sometimes they will have to drop down to the ground and then climb up a piece of grass or something to get a little bit of height, so that they can fly back to their nest. Often, for most of us that work with them, because we tend to identify with them pretty closely, if we see one of them struggling to get back, we will let them crawl up under our finger and raise it up high, give them a little bit of height, and they'll rest for a minute or so and then take off again, and that extra height helps them get back sometimes. The bigger wasps tend to specialize more on some of these really big, high-value prey items. The smaller wasps will tend to feed on smaller prey. The number of prey that they bring back to their nests depends on a couple of things. One, it depends on whether she's laid a female egg or a male egg, because the females are so much larger, they need more food to develop. A male doesn't need as much. But it's also then, how big the prey item is. So if you get a great big dicerca like this female on the finger there, they may only need 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 beetles to feed a single egg, a single larva. But if you see this on the this other picture here, she's got a very small, probably a gryllus, just underneath her head and thorax, and she's going to need a lot more, 10, 15 of those to feed her young, each larva. And so, as I said, she will fill her egg chamber with any number of beetles, depending on the size of the beetle and the sex of the eggs, and then she'll seal that egg chamber off and excavate a new egg chamber and then start doing the same. So in that first summer, we did some excavating of nests to see what we could see, and here you can see this is a pre-pupa. So the eggs are laid in the summer, and the female, or the wasp larva, will feed on these paralyzed, still alive and fresh, but paralyzed beetles. And then in the fall, they will turn into a pre-pupa, spends the winter as a pre-pupa, and then in the spring it will pupate and emerge out as an adult the following summer. And here we will see if this works. Here's just a very short video. Seems to be working. You can see there she's got a big dicerca. And again, she's carrying her dicerca back to her nest. Watch her come in. And this one you'll see a velvet ant come, and then the female's carrying a beetle and comes in. So that's just a very short little video of some close-up pictures of this really amazing little wasp. And so that sort of is the basic biology. And so Philip Careless, who is this grad student from Guelph that was working on these, he kind of learned this basic biology, and and he was working in an area where they actually had emerald ash borer, and he noticed that, as well as collecting the native buprestids, they did a good job of bringing in the emerald ash borer. So he was wondering, could we use this to monitor for EAV? And this really intrigued me, and we were certainly starting to be concerned in Maine back then about emerald ash borer, and there weren't really great ways of monitoring for it. And so this seemed like a really good addition. So the first thing I did was I went to our insect collection to see if we had Cerceris cubenpennis in the state. And there was nothing in our insect collection, nothing at all. So I started contacting some of the entomologists in other states, and nobody had any Cerceris cubenpennis in their collection. Some of them had other species of Cerceris. And finally, Don Chandler in New Hampshire, he had one in his collection. So I was like, maybe it's not in Maine. And so that's where MES comes in. So I started to talk to people at MES, and I think I actually wrote some articles and maybe even gave a talk that winter about the possibility of doing this. And was talking to Dave Burke and Dana Michaud, and Dana said, yeah, Dave and I were collecting in a gravel pit one day, and there was this wasp or this insect that came along and was carrying something, and I tried to knock it out of the air, and I didn't knock the insect down. I think it was a wasp. Didn't knock the wasp down, but I made it drop the beetle, and it was a buprestid. I thought, well, that sounds encouraging. As far as I know, there's no other wasp that actually specializes on buprestid, so maybe it's in the state. And then Monica Russo, who lives down in the very far southern part of Maine, she actually had one in her collection. So it's like, okay, we do know that they are at least in southern Maine, and it might be worthwhile, going a little further and seeing what we can do. So that first year, 2008, I did a lot of looking. Basically, anytime I was out doing field work, doing anything else, I would stop, figure out where schools were using Google Earth before I left for my day of field work, find out where all the schools were, and then on my way home at the end of the day, I'd stop by all the schools and check out all their baseball diamonds to see if there was any Cerceris colonies there. And we did find about 30 colonies that first year. Most of them were found by by us in the Maine Forest Service, but 5 of them were found by MES members. I think most of them were probably Dave and Dana, who really enjoyed doing a lot of collecting in gravel pits, and they found most of our gravel pit colonies was thanks to them. We were able to kind of delimit the range of where Cerceris was in the state, and it was basically in the southwestern corner. The very furthest most northern colonies we had were up in Dover Foxcroft. And later we found some in Guilford, Rangeley. Those colonies were really small, like 1 or 2 or 5 wasps, not very big and robust colonies. And they didn't seem to go much east of Bangor area. So we were sort of thinking that the soil might be not quite right for them up north. Don't know if the cold winters would really limit them, but it seemed to be that cool summers limited them. They were fine down deep in the ground over winter, but they really liked the heat to get going, to have a good day of hunting. And when we had a cool spring, their emergence could be delayed by a couple of weeks, making for a very short hunting season. So it seems to be that they want a good hot summer. And so that might be why we didn't find them down east. That first season, 2008, was the year that summer didn't happen. It was cold, cold, cold. People kept their wood stoves burning all summer, wore their wool sweaters. It rained almost every day right till the end of July. And so Cerceris didn't even emerge till very, very late. And when it did, most of the time it was raining and they didn't hunt and we couldn't go out and collect. So we didn't collect a whole lot. We had about 45 buprestids that we collected in 6 genera and 11 species. So that winter, I think I remember telling you that Philip Careless had been giving talks at the big national emerald ash borer meeting, or international emerald ash borer meeting for all of North America. It was a meeting that was held every year to try to deal with this new emerging pest that was just huge. And so he had given talks for 2 years and basically, saying, we think we can maybe use this as a way to monitor for emerald ash borer. And basically all the serious scientists kind of patted him on the head and said, nice idea, son, kind of cool, but never going to be important, never going to really be a way of monitoring. These guys were getting the millions of dollars to develop purple traps and other things. And there was just truly nobody gave him any credit for doing anything at all practical. So the 3rd year he went back to this meeting, and I went to this meeting as well. And I showed these results, which were, pretty pitiful. We collected 45 buprestids. That's not much, but at that point in time, by that meeting, I had realized that we were going to have to move to a volunteer-based system because it was just hard for one person to do all of that. And so I talked to them about finding colonies all throughout the southern part of the state, which was the highest risk for us, and the work that I had already done about getting volunteers to adopt a local colony and do some monitoring. And all of a sudden, this idea that Philip had, which they didn't give much credence to, all of a sudden when they saw, maybe it can be done on a statewide level, and all of a sudden people started to take it a lot more seriously. And just for comparison, that year in 2008, I think, was the first year that we did any real purple trap work. I mean, we put out, I think, 30 purple traps, and we caught all of 3 buprestids on all of those purple traps. And so this was actually, you could see it was maybe a legitimate way of adding to the way we monitored for EAB. But we definitely needed volunteers. There was a fairly short seasonal activity. The wasps only really hunted for about 4 to 5, maybe 6 weeks, depending on the summer. And it was a pretty short daily activity period. They tended to hunt from the late morning to the early afternoon. It was also pretty weather dependent. If it was cloudy or too cold or too windy, they couldn't hunt. And so for me to do all of this, there was a lot of travel time, and there was unpredictable weather. And there were more times that I wanted to admit to that I would spend 2.5 hours to drive all the way up to a great colony up in Freiburg. And I would get there and an afternoon thunderstorm would roll in, and zip, 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 all the wasps would go flying back to their nests so they didn't get drowned in the thunderstorm. And that was it for the end of the day. There was going to be no biosurveillance. I could just turn around and drive home again. That was kind of my day. So we definitely needed to have local volunteers who could go out and take a look at what was happening. And if the wasps weren't hunting for some reason because it was too cold or too windy, they could turn around and go home and try again the next day. So that was definitely, I knew we needed to do that. So that winter, I did created some literature to try to get people interested in this and educate them on what we were doing. And I started to try to recruit potential volunteers. I was brand new to the state. I was brand new to the country. So I didn't have a really good network of people to contact. I think if I were to do something like this now, I would probably have an easier time of it. But I was basically talking to whoever I could that might be interested. And then I was also trying to teach other states, because we had gotten a grant, and the grant basically said, Maine's going to try to figure out how to do this and then teach everybody else how to do this. And so I felt like I was about like one half a step ahead of everybody else. And I was desperately trying to figure out how to do it, and then give that information to other people and other states, and have them, you know, work on this as well. So I created a more extensive trifold, which was basically a really brief summary of everything we knew about how to find colonies of wasps, and how to set up a biosurveillance program. And that was something that we gave to all of the other states in New England. And most of them used it just as is for several years until they got their own programs up and running a little bit more, and then kind of made it a bit more personalized for them, for their own state. So what is involved in a biosurveillance program? Well, first of all, we needed to find the cerceris colonies, and we just realized that that was something the Maine Forest Service really had to do. Sometimes it's difficult to find them, and sometimes it's a little bit depressing work to do, because you go to 20 sites that all look really good, and you might only find one colony. So we would find the colonies and then try to find volunteers that could adopt those colonies. And what we'd ask them to do is go out to their site at least 3 times during the summer, and for 1 to 3 hours or so at a time, and collect beetles. Either take them from wasps that were flying in, or pick them up off the ground, because wasps would sometimes drop the beetles and leave them there because they didn't want to pick up beetles on the ground. They might have been parasitized by those parasites. And so pick those up and steal them, label them, stick them in the freezer, and then send them in to us at the end of the summer. And we gave them everything they needed. We gave them nets and baggies and mailing tubes, and even a little vial with emearld ash borer in it, so that if they found anything that looked even remotely like emearld ash borer, they could let us know right away rather than waiting to send it in at the end of the summer. And so the original way of collecting these was to put this little collar over the nest. And I told you these wasps were pretty tolerant to us messing with them. So we would put this little collar, we'd anchor it to the ground with a gulf tee, and put the hole over the nest. And the wasp would go in and out just fine. She would learn that this is still my nest, even though it's got this strange thing on it. And so she could go in and out of that hole just fine. However, if she was carrying prey, she couldn't get it in through that hole. And so that would give us time to then go over and just take that prey away from her. Remember that she doesn't sting. And if you look closely here, you can see this is a picture from Philip Careless, that the female there has an emearld ash borer. The wasp is an emearld ash borer, and she stung and paralyzed the emearld ash borer, but there was a male that was mating with it. And he wasn't paralyzed, but he wasn't going to let go. So apparently, he ended up getting nabbed as well. Apparently, a buprestid will do just about anything for love. So that was one way of collecting them. That other way was just to use an insect net. And we found that the cheap little dollar store butterfly nets were the best thing to give to our volunteers, because they were cheap, but also they were much less big and solid than the professional insect net, and so much less likely to damage cerceris when you caught her. So the idea was you could see that wasp as she was coming in kind of low and heavy, and a straight line making a beeline for her nest, and you could recognize that flight as compared to the slow spiraling orientation flight as she left the nest. So you could tell which ones were coming in. You would nab them. The shock of netting her usually made her drop the wasp into the bottom of the net. If she didn't drop the wasp, you just sort of would gently tease it away from her, then open up the net, let her go, and collect the wasp. So our young volunteers really, really liked the nets. It was fun to run around and chase down the wasp and catch them as they came in. Some of our older volunteers, not quite so agile, they preferred to use the collars. And so we left it up to our volunteers which they wanted to use. And often people would use a combination of both. But it was really up to them. Both methods worked well. And so we did find that biosurveillance seemed to be a pretty good match for a citizen science program. and talking to them, we found that most of our volunteers came back year after year. And so why did the wasp watchers enjoy this? What made it a good fit for volunteers? And talking to them, some of the things that I found was the sites were not intimidating. For us, that seems a little bit, maybe a little bit of an odd thing to say, because most of us probably are pretty comfortable outside, outdoors, in the woods. But for some people who don't get out in the woods, it's a little intimidating to go out into the woods. But to go out to the baseball diamond of the elementary school down the end of your street, that's not so scary. And so it was non-intimidating. It was fair weather entomology. Wasps hunt on sunny days. You don't have to go out in the rain, miserable weather. And so it was something that was really kid friendly, family friendly, and something that people couldn't do quite easily. And it wasn't difficult. It wasn't intimidating. The other thing is you got to work with some really cool insects. For me, I know because I work with invasive species, I tend to feel like I'm often always talking about the bad insects and how to kill them and how to slow them down, how to protect the trees from them, and how to get rid of them, how to keep them out of the state. And I sometimes feel like we're forgetting that the majority of insects are really good insects, and it's kind of fun instead of always working with the bad insects, with the pest insects, with the invasives that don't belong here. It was fun to work with some of the good guys. It's fun to work with allies who are helping us monitor for emerald ash borer. And I found that most of our volunteers felt the same way. There were a number of kids that would start out saying, "Ooh, I'm not going to touch a bug." And they would come to actually identify with these insects. In fact, one of the biggest worries and complaints from some of our volunteers was, well, I don't want to take away their prey from them. They've worked so hard to get it. And so actually, fortunately, we were able to tell them, that really big bronze dicerca, the one that's as big as the wasp or even bigger, though it was really easy to see them when they came in with those. And so we were able to tell people, if you see them flying in with that big, bright bronze beetle underneath of them, you can just let that one go and mark it down as not emerald ash borer. It's a dicerca. And so that made them a little happier to they could let their wasps keep those big high value preys. And so people did really enjoy working with them. It was almost a challenge to go walking out into a colony and see if you could catch sight of them sitting in their nests, guarding their nests, and you see this little face peering up at you. The other thing is that often when citizen scientists are involved in monitoring for some kind of invasive species, it's not there and it's not there, and you go out time and time again and it's not there and it's not there. And sometimes people can get almost a little bit discouraged. Sometimes people wonder, am I missing it? Have I forgotten what it looks like? Am I not seeing it? And even if that doesn't happen, sometimes it's just a little bit boring if you're always going out and you're not finding something. Now, as scientists, we know that negative data, negative results are hugely important, but it can be a little bit discouraging for some people if they go out and never find anything. In this case, even though they're not finding emerald ash borer, they're coming back with all sorts of really interesting things. A handful of buprestid, it's all different shapes and sizes and colors. And they feel like they're being productive because they have all of this that they're able to send in. And also, they found new species. Because buprestids are hard to collect, we don't really have that many, relatively speaking, fewer buprestids in our collection than many other insects. But this is a specialist. This wasp is a specialist in hunting for EAB, or sorry, for buprestids, and so we had new records. And if we did, when we identified the beetles that people brought back in, if somebody had a new state record in their collection, I would be sure to call them up and let them know that they were the ones that caught these new beetles that we had never seen before, never collected in the state, and that they were going to be mentioned in our annual report. So I think that was something that made it a little bit more encouraging for our volunteers, because they felt like they were doing something productive, even when they didn't find emerald ash borer. Come on, there. So who were the volunteers? We had a whole range of volunteers. And for me, the most difficult part of this whole thing was probably the recruiting of volunteers. It was hard for me to find people because people had to be local to wherever we happened to find a colony. And sometimes they were in tiny little towns. Sometimes they were in bigger cities where there was a city arborist or a tree warden or parks and rec staff, and sometimes our volunteers came from that. Girl Scout troops, amateur entomologists, that would be you guys. There were a ton of people from MES that adopted colonies near where they lived, and that was hugely helpful. Especially since it was so hard to find volunteers. Having you guys there and a bunch of different colonies gave me a really good starting point. But there were families. There was a high school teacher. We found a colony at its high school, and he volunteered to adopt that colony. And he and his two sons came out and were did a really good job of doing biosurveillance there. Often we had town councilors and select people and clerks. That happened because sometimes I just couldn't find anybody, and I was reduced to calling up a town office and saying, this is who I am, and this is what our program is, and we've got this colony at your elementary school, and can you think of anybody in your town who might be interested in doing biosurveillance? And often they would say, well, that sounds pretty cool. I'll do that. So that was good. So there's just a really wide range of people who were involved in this. And so just very briefly, I want to tell you a little quick story of one of the Girl Scouts who was probably one of my best volunteers. I had been going out and giving some sort of recruiting talks to there was a big Boy Scout leaders meeting for the entire region. And I gave a talk there, and then the Girl Scouts asked me to come, and I gave a talk there one spring evening and came out and thought, yeah, well, that was a waste of an evening. It was a beautiful spring day. Oh, well. And then a few days later, I got a call from a woman, and she said, I live in Poland. I think there was you had a colony in Poland on your list of colonies where you're looking for volunteers. My Girl Scout troop might be interested. So I came and talked to them, and every single one of them started out saying, ew, bugs, I'm not going to touch a bug. And as I started to talk to them, they started to get more and more interested. And actually, one of the things that really kind of intrigued them was they said, oh, so she's kind of a single mother. The male dies, and then the female has to do all the hunting and building the nest and bringing the food in to the babies. And the leader told me later, she said, yeah, several of these girls are being raised by single mothers. And they started to identify with this wasp. The girl in the background there, in the green vest, she was actually going to start her bronze award. And so these are the girls here who said, oh, I'm never going to touch a dead bug. So she was going to start her bronze award, and she needed to do a big project that had some community involvement and involved her sort of taking responsibility and doing something kind of big. So she said she would do biosurveillance on these colonies. She would take responsibility for getting parents to drive her and some of her friends to this site. And when they couldn't do that, they stuck their nets on the back of their bikes and biked in, and she was responsible for getting biosurveillance done at that site. And then, as it turned out, she found a colony at her own school on the other side of town, And so she had me come in and give a talk to her grade 3 or 4 class. I think she might have been grade 4, about the biosurveillance that she was doing there at this, just on the outside of their playground at the school. She was pretty amazing. The second year, we had a big crew come down from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick because they wanted to learn about biosurveillance. And I asked her if she wanted to come out when I took them out to one of the sites, just so that they could meet one of our volunteers. And she said, well, as long as I don't have to give a talk or something. I said, no, of course not. So she came out and did a good job of showing them, what she did, and talk to them about, talk to individuals about biosurveillance and what she did as a volunteer. And then she gave a presentation at the end of it, and Mike Bona from the U.S. Forest Service came up, and I came out, and she gave a presentation about everything that she had done, and she got her bronze award. And she then continued on for the next 4 years, I think, until she turned about 15 or 16 and went away for the summer. Every summer she did biosurveillance in all of the colonies in Poland, and was just a really great volunteer. And so I wanted to be sure that our volunteers felt like they were appreciated. Most of them were doing things in kind of solitary way. They didn't see what the others were doing. And so at the end of the first season, with Charlene's help, because she and I were working in the same lab, she helped a little bit. We put together sort of a thank you party for them. And so I created a sorceress chocolate cake. I'll have you know that this is the pinnacle, the very peak of my cake decorating career. Never again will I do anything like this. But it was anatomically and taxonomically correct right down to the wing venation, and bars of chocolate for the legs and the antennae, and spent hours and hours of my life on that. It was briefly admired and then eaten. Not ever going to happen again. But for one brief shining moment, there was a sorceress cake in the world. And so we had door prizes for everybody. We kind of scrounged and got together whatever we could. Philip Careless up in his lab up in Ontario, he had printed a bunch of t-shirts, sort of a skull and crossbones motif here, with a crossed emerald ash borer and bronze birch borer, and it says the beetle bandit that's underneath of it, with the sorceress face on it. And those, we had several of those to give away, and they were the really coveted prize item. We made sure we had enough prizes for every kid that had participated, as well as some of the adults. And we had a surprise visit by an emerald ash borer, and the astute and very observant among you will probably recognize that emerald ash borer. There was also a journalist who had written several articles about emerald ash borer and about biosurveillance and about some of our volunteers. So he'd written several articles. He was also a singer-songwriter, and he wrote the emerald ash borer song. So he came and he played that song for us. So we just sort of had this little appreciation thank you party for our volunteers. Did that for a couple of years. So beyond doing, beyond collecting wasps and collecting beetles, and adopting colonies and being a lot more productive than just what we as Maine Forest staff could do, what all were some of the benefits that our volunteers brought to this program. One of the big things that I wasn't really expecting was that there was just a huge amount of media interest. There were, in those first couple of years, probably over a dozen stories in print and in the on television about biosurveillance. Now, if it had been just me out doing that, would there have been that interest, there would have been some stories because, this is a pretty cool system. I mean, as entomologists, we obviously think this is really cool to use one insect to hunt for another one. But, even non-entomologists, it can be kind of interesting. But when you bring in the fact that there are local volunteers doing something, almost every small town, that their local papers would write about the town councilor or the town selectman or the Girl Scouts in the town doing biosurveillance. And some of these stories made them to bigger papers. There were a number of bigger stories. There was a really major article in the Boston Globe and in USA Today. So just the fact that we had volunteers that were involved in this made it a much more human interest story. And this was back in 2009 when emerald ash borer was really not on anybody's radar. There were a handful of entomologists. We were certainly very concerned about this. The Wabanaki tribes were very concerned about this because they were basket makers. Ash was a huge part of their culture. And they had seen what was happening in Michigan with the basket makers there. And so they were very concerned. But other than that, there just wasn't really that much interest and concern about EAB, and most people hadn't heard about it. And so all of these interviews brought EAB just a little bit more into the foreground and made people aware of it, raised awareness. So if you're talking to a cute little kid and why are you doing this? Well, it's kind of cool and I'm learning about insects and it's fun to play with them. And there's this invasive species that's in Michigan and it's coming our way and can't really tell if it gets here. And so these wasps are good at hunting it. All of a sudden EAB gets mentioned. And then somebody sent me an article in the Down East magazine. And that you've arrived when people are actually writing satire about you. So he was writing about this, the strange goings on in Maine. And what are these strange Maine scientists doing? So anyway, he says, the wasps, which don't sting, capture all kinds of beetles out of trees with the intent of taking them home to make beetle burgers. The scientists and volunteers net the wasps and check their victims to see if any of them are ash borers. If they aren't, and so far they haven't been, the humans return the beetles to the wasps, apologize, shake one of their little fumipennant legs, and send them on their way as if the whole affair hadn't been an enormous inconvenience. The wasps then call their relative, the giant Sumatran death-dealing stinging hornet, and ask it to visit Maine, where some human pests need to be taught a lesson in insect etiquette. So I thought that was pretty funny that, there'd been so much interest in this that, people who I'd never even heard of and who'd never talked to me had heard enough about it to write humor pieces about it. Above and beyond that, probably one of the most important things that our volunteers did was basically to be a model for all of the other states. As I said, Maine was sort of learning and figuring out things and then trying to teach them to all of the other states. And so as I created this network of wasp watchers, we exported that to other states, and almost every state in the eastern US had some form of volunteer wasp watching program. I did a search online just to see what there was out there now. A lot of the states have been inundated with EAB, and so they're not even looking for EAB anymore, but there still are a fair number of them out there. Some of them have really cool logos, better logos than we have in Maine. But it goes all the way south. There were wasp watcher networks all the way south to Louisiana and Georgia, out as far west as Wisconsin and Minnesota. And that was probably something that is maybe what we should be the most proud of, that as MES, who you guys were a part of putting this together at the very beginning, we created something that was used by almost every other state. And here's a map from 2009. And you can see that, in the first year, these squares up here, it was up in Maine, we were the first ones to find a lot of colonies. By 2009, I had taught other states how to do this, and they were finding colonies all throughout. There were a ton in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so this was really spreading. By 2009, in New England and New York, we had found 242 colonies. 1,000 plus buprestids were collected, 55 species and 11 genera. In Maine, we had 60 colonies. We had collected, of those 1,000 buprestids, we had collected over 500 of them. So we were still, for this first few years, we were kind of ahead of the other states because we were the first ones that had done this, and we're just a little further along in the process. We had 4 new state records. We had 1 new genus. So it was an entire genus of buprestids that had never been seen in the state before that we found with biosurveillance. And we had 18 volunteers or groups of volunteers who adopted colonies, which was really huge. And over the years, we found that other states quickly surpassed Maine. Connecticut, as you can see, they've got tons of colonies down there, way more than we did. If you look at the map, you can see that Maine is right at the northern edge of the range of Cerceris vivipennis. And a lot of our colonies were really small, too small to do any biosurveillance. And so there were, we were soon surpassed by other states, which was great. It was great to see that other states took this and ran with it and went further than we could. And some of them had huge wasp watcher programs. APHIS actually, which is the federal regulatory board, they actually made this part of the official way to monitor for emearld ash borer. And if any of you have ever worked with federal regulatory institutions, you know that they're about as quick and nimble as the Queen Mary. They don't change quickly and easily. So that was kind of impressive. So those are some of the huge successes. Why are we not really using biosurveillance that much anymore? Well, as I said, we're sort of on the northern edge of the range of Cerceris. And we would find that often we had great volunteers, but the colonies in their areas were too small to do, I should say, to compare. We hung purple traps and didn't catch any buprestids that year. Often we would have colonies that were too small to really do really good biosurveillance. Sometimes we'd have good colonies. We'd get a good volunteer, adopt that colony, be willing to stay year after year. And then after a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, the colony would slowly die out, or the vegetation changed. The baseball diamond grew up in grass and Cerceris moved out, or somebody started to use the gravel pit again and destroyed the colony. So there were a lot of reasons that we kind of had higher turnover in our nests, in our colonies. And so some colonies would disappear. We'd find new colonies, and then I have to go and recruit new volunteers. And so because of the difficulty of recruiting volunteers, in the end, our biosurveillance wasp watchers program kind of petered out a little bit. We still occasionally have volunteers that are interested. I don't go out as actively recruiting them anymore. But if people come to us and say, I'm interested in doing this, is there a colony near me? I will get them all set up with everything they need. And so this is not really meant to be a recruiting talk. But if anybody does see a colony, the big circles there are the bigger colonies that are good for biosurveillance. If you see something near where you live and you think this sounds like fun, definitely give me a call, and I can get you set up. But otherwise, that's biosurveillance, and how volunteers, including you guys, were involved in it. So thank you.
All righty, thank you, Colleen, so much. Great presentation there, and great stories as well. That's a really neat program. So Let's check out the chat box. I only see one question in there, so I'd like to invite everybody to get your questions in if you haven't already. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and ask Colleen that before the comments start coming in. So Colleen, do you know if the male cerceris only has to fertilize the female once and then he's done, or do the males have to stick around to continue mating repeatedly, is the question from Kathy.
I'm guessing that it's only once because they die within a week of emergence. And then the females are around for another 5 or 6 weeks. So I suspect it's only once.
I would guess so too. Great. Let's see, comment / question from Bob. He says he would love to know who wrote that piece that you quoted. Unless that's a joke that it was he.
I can look that up. Oh, here, hang on. I can go look it up right now if you want to carry on asking questions. I'll see if I can find that.
Question from Steve Melcher. He asks if there's any sites out on the islands.
I don't know. My guess is that'd be less likely to be on the islands, just because they seem to like warm summers, and the islands tend to have cooler summers. And in fact, it's only in the south part of the coast where we find that we have coastal colonies at all. As we get further down east, we find fewer and fewer, and so we think that it's because the summers get too cool. But it'd be worthwhile looking if you're at a school playground or school ball field, playing field. Take a look. There might be something.
Yeah, to that note, I was kind of curious. I don't know that New York looked on Long Island, but with all those colonies in Connecticut there, then all the sandy soils in Long Island, I was surprised not to see any colonies on that map. But anyways.
Sorry, my cat just got something off the counter.
Seamus has had enough. So, all right, I don't see any more questions. So if there's anybody that wants to unmute maybe and ask something, otherwise, yeah, just seeing a lot of thanks and praise in the chat box there, Colleen. So yeah, thank you again.
And just the person who wants to know who wrote the article, give me just a second and I'm looking it up.
All right, well, Colleen's looking for that. I'll just make a couple of announcements to the group here about upcoming events. So hopefully folks here are signed up, but just in a couple weeks here, or maybe less than that, on Saturday, January 22nd, we'll be having our annual winter workshop. Slight change of plans, as folks are probably aware that are registered. We've decided to play it extra safe and go completely virtual again this year instead of doing a hands-on workshop in Augusta. So yeah, if that was a barrier to anybody getting registered, it's totally virtual now. So please go ahead and sign up. You can do that on the MES website if you're interested. And then as far as webinars, we'll be back again next month. February 10th is the date. So save that date, same time, 7 to 8 p.m. on Thursday evening. I will be featuring Brandon Wu, and he'll be talking about grasshoppers of Maine. You figured that out yet, Colleen?
Yeah, Al Diamond, down
Al
east
Diamond
writes humor for the Down East. It was many years ago. I have no idea if he's still writing. But.
Yeah. All right, and then one final question, because we're at time. Another question from Kathy. It says some schools are spraying playgrounds to kill ticks. Will BT, etc., also kill these fun wasps?
Actually, the wasps are relatively difficult to kill because they're down in the ground. And so if they spray in the evening or in the morning when the wasps are down and whatever the pesticide gets dried, they might be okay. I've had some people that are scared of wasps when they try to kill ground dwelling wasps, and they're surprisingly difficult to kill, which is a good thing.
Yep, that is good news. So, all righty. Well, that brings us to time, like I said. So yeah, just thanks again, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Colleen. this presentation will be posted on the MES website eventually. And with that, I bid you all a good night. So thanks again and see you again soon. Take care.
Okay, thank you.